We have been doing a series on work the last 3 weeks, and I found this today, or this week, 5 commandments for working hard. Number 1, never walk without a document in your hands. Never walk around the office. People with documents in their hands look like hardworking employees heading for important meetings. People with nothing in their hands look like they're heading to the cafeteria. People with a newspaper in their hands look like they're going to the restroom. Above all, make sure you carry loads of stuff at home with you at night, thus generating the false impression that you work longer hours than they do. Number 1. Number 2, use computers to look busy. Anytime you use a computer, it looks like work to the people around you, but you can send and receive personal email, chat, and generally have a blast without having to do anything remotely related to work. Number 3, a messy desk. Top management can get away with a clean desk, but for the rest of us, it looks like you're not working hard enough if you have a clean desk. Build huge piles of documents around your workspace. And then note this one. To the observer, last year's work looks a lot like this year's work to them. Nobody's going to know the difference. And if somebody's coming to your cubicle, take the document that you need and hide it halfway down under a stack. And when they come to see you, pull it out of the stack, like you know exactly where it is. Number 4, voicemail. Never answer your phone if you have voicemail. People don't call you just because they want to give you something for nothing. They call because they want you to work for them. That's no way to live. I love that. If somebody leaves you a voice message for you and it sounds like impending work, respond during lunch hour when you know when they won't be there. It looks like you're hardworking over lunch hour and conscientious, even though you're being a devious weasel. So I just thought, yeah, that's really important to do there. Important things for work. Well, we have been doing a few weeks on work. The first week we did the eternal value of work. Unless your work is dishonoring to the Lord, your work has eternal value to it. If you struggle with that, like most of us do, because work is work, it's hard, it's not easy for the most part, then I would recommend you go back and listen to our first message on this. Week number 2, we did a message on what the Puritans used to call the work ethic. Diligence, the sluggard, the sloth, laziness. What does it mean to be diligent at work? Last week, we looked at 3 things. Work motivation, work effort and energy, and number 3, work relationships. And today we look at what responsibilities do I have as an employee, both to the company and to my boss, or if you have a manager or a supervisor. And next week, we'll look at our last one. What responsibilities do you have if you are a boss or an owner or a manager to those who work for you? Obviously, some of the things that we could say today about responsibilities of employees are things that we've looked at the last few weeks. But today, what I want to highlight is something that is really surprising when you first read this in the New Testament. And that is our work attitude and how we think about our boss, even the worst of bosses. And most of the verses we're going to look at are verses that are related where the writer is speaking to slaves who are in some type of bondage to masters. Now, back in those days, sometimes there was chattel slavery, like what we normally think of. But there was also things like indentured servants, where you voluntarily put yourself in as a servant or a slave for a number of years in exchange for getting out of debt, or in our case with America, passage from across the Atlantic Ocean here several hundred years ago. The directions that are given to slaves, none of us are slaves that I know of, but the principles are the same regarding employees related to your boss. So if you have a boss that you think is just next to Satan, it may not be quite as bad as think about some of what these people went through. The first thing that the scripture says is be responsive to authority. And the word that's used are 2 words that are used: to submit or to be subject. Titus 2:9 says, teach slaves to be subject to their masters in everything, to try to please them, not to talk back to them, not to steal from them, but to show that they can be fully trusted. And the word means to be subject means to submit or to willingly on your own fall under the authority of the boss. Or we might say to be amenable, to have an amenable spirit, to try to figure out how to follow your boss, even though his boss may be a knucklehead. And here what Paul tells Titus is there are some actions and some attitudes that he tells the slaves. The actions are be subject to the masters, try to please them, don't talk back, and not steal. But then the things that strike me the most are what attitudes are behind this. And he mentions 3. To be subject as an attitude. The thing I wonder about is that at your work, is that how would your boss say that you're agreeable, amenable with them? To try to please them, you're making an effort to do that. And the end goal is that you may be fully trusted by that. In other words, you're creating goodwill. We talked about this last week. The opposite of being subject or to submit there are 2 really interesting Greek words. One of them is, and this is in your handout, heretikos, which we get our English word heresy or heretic. And the idea of this word is to be stubbornly divergent. Just to see what I ought to do or what the boss wants me to do, but there's some resistance in me that's not going to do that. I'm going to do something different than what the boss wants me to do. Now, we translate that into the word heretic, which is really kind of a fascinating thing. The second word is the Greek word schisma, from which we get our word English schism. And here, the opposite of to subject under the boss or to submit yourself is to create division. Schism means to create a separation. Now, the workroom at work is infamous for creating division against the boss. And here, Paul tells even slaves, be subject to those who are your masters. Secondly, what motivations are there to submit to the boss? Well, one good motivation, if for no other reason, your own self-preservation, is to keep a job or to keep getting a paycheck. But one of the things I really appreciate about the verses we're looking at today is that the writers lift our eyes to a higher reason to follow what the boss says or to be amenable to the boss. Titus 2:9, teach slaves to be subject to their masters in everything. Try to please them, not to talk back to them, not to steal from them, but to show they can be fully trusted. Well, that's the verse we read just a minute ago. But he continues, so that they will make the teaching about God our Savior attractive. Now, what he's saying here is, it's good for your paycheck and it's good to continue to have a job, to get along with the boss and to try to follow along what the boss is doing. But there's a higher reason here, and that is that you become somebody like me at work. You have a chance to shine the gospel light through your life, through your attitude related to the boss. And I like the way Paul tells Titus is to make the teaching about God, our Savior, attractive. Now, what does he mean by that? How does my attitude towards my boss make the teaching of God attractive? Well, if you've ever been a boss or a manager or a supervisor and you have somebody like this on your team, you already intuitively know what he's talking about. You appreciate somebody who's trying to pull the wagon with you and not fight you or try to do something divergent. In other words, it's something that's unique. It's pretty rare, and it just is fitting. It fits what ought to happen and to make the workplace go better. And finally, it's refreshing. It's refreshing. It grabs the attention. It's sort of like a marshmallow that you get out of a bag, and it's kind of puffy and something, but you warm it over a fire to make a s'more, and it sort of melts, and then something better happens. That's sort of the image that Paul is telling Titus here to teach the slaves. On the inside of your handout, what if I have a harsh boss or an unjust boss? And in the book of Peter, 1 Peter 2, Peter addresses this, and again, he directs it to slaves. Again, if you have a boss that you think is pretty unjust and pretty harsh, at least you get to go home at the end of the day. You get to drive in your car. You get to watch TV. You get to cook in your kitchen. You get a paycheck. For these slaves, none of these things were to them. So here's what he says to them. Submit yourself to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. And here's the first situation that these fellows face is harshness. Verse 19. It is commendable if a man bears up under the pain of unjust suffering. There's another situation, the pain of unjust suffering, because he is conscious of God. Verse 20. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating? And sometimes slaves were beaten. If you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it, but if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable to God. These are some horrible situations that these fellows are in. And yet, notice what he tells how your response is to be. These are the responses you're to aim at in spite of these terrible situations. Back in verse 18, he says, submit yourselves. Submit yourselves to your masters with all respect. Now, how do you submit yourself with all respect to somebody who's treating you poorly, harshly, unjustly? We'll look at this in just a minute. Verse 19, it is commendable if a man bears up under the pain of unjust suffering. There, the verb is to bear up. It's to endure is the idea, to keep moving forward, to bearing up. Verse 20, how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? A situation that will not change. It continues on day after day after day. This is our response. Now, in this passage, he mentions two things as it relates to God. How are we to think about, how does God relate to all this? Well, the Bible does not condone slavery, but what it does is it speaks to those who are in the bondage of slavery and tells them how to think. And it tells them how God is working through even a situation as horrible as slavery is. It keeps coming back to what's the higher thing that's going on here. And he tries to lift our eyes to those higher things to see the greater story than just our small story. In verse 19, listen to what he says here. It is commendable if a man bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because he is conscious of God. So here, this is where, as a Christian, we have a tremendous resource available to us that is able to look above just the normal situation, the harshness that I face that is just so debilitating and sometimes painful, to something higher, conscious of God. And at the end of verse 20, he says, if you endure it, this is commendable before God. And here, this is sort of that sort of attaboy that you hear from heaven, that God is aware of what you're going through, and he commends you as you go through it. There are times in our life where, this just goes so against the grain, because we come to the Bible and we hope to find wisdom to solve our problems in the Bible. And there's certainly times where that happens. But essentially, and this is a great example of this, we come to God not to find wisdom to solve our problems, but to find God through our problems. And as we find God through and in the midst of our problems, we find the treasure that we most need in our relationship with him. And then through that, we find wisdom to deal with the situation that we find ourselves in. Verse 21 illustrates the end of what I just said. To this you were called because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. You're in a situation that's very, very difficult, and it doesn't change day after day after day. What Peter would say is, welcome to the club. This should not be a surprise. We have been called to this, he says. Now, years ago when I was a young Christian and in college, I remember pastors talking about called to the ministry. And the only time I heard that word called was related to professional ministry to do what I do. But the Bible talks about a calling that every Christian has. There's a number of callings that we all have. And this is one of them. That when we find ourselves in difficult situations, there is something higher going on. We have a chance to reflect the wonder of who Jesus Christ is through our attitude and our endurance as we go through this. We follow the example of someone who's gone before us. Verse 22, he committed no sin. No deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. There are times in your life, maybe at work, maybe with relatives or other situations that are very, very difficult, where the example of Jesus in these two verses should pull you along and encourage you in the midst of them. How he responds is quite differently than how we do. The last thing I want to mention here is respecting the boss and obeying the boss. 1 Timothy 6:1. All who are under the yoke of slavery should consider their masters worthy of full respect so that God's name and teaching may not be slandered. The two verbs here that are important is time is the word honor, or dignity is the first thing. And the second thing, he talks about full respect, worthy of full respect. Or it means to hold someone in high regard. What if you have a person that's hard to hold in high regard? He said, well, what you're trying to do is you start with the position of authority and you work from that point, and then you move then towards the person. And your first step is to think about the benefits or the good qualities of your boss in spite of the things that drive you nuts about your boss. So these are sort of things that we aspire to be, that God is trying to build in our lives. But then verse in 6:1, Timothy 6:1, again, I like the word consider. All who are under the yoke of slavery should consider their masters worthy of respect. What he's talking about here is a choice. I'm going to count it as if it's true that even in this situation, I am going to be respectful. And then Ephesians 6:5, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but like slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly. Serve wholeheartedly. As if you were serving the Lord, not men, because you know the Lord will reward everyone for whatever good he does, whether he is a slave or free. And the word obey here just means to put yourself under, to listen, to heed, very similar to the word to be amenable to. What strikes me here about verse 7 is the parallel between obeying the boss and obeying the Lord. If you're a Christian, you have some familiarity with this, and so do I. You and I came to Christ, probably most of us, because we had a track record of trying to live life our way, thinking that was the best course of life and that was going to get the life we wanted. And we kept running into brick walls. And life wasn't enough, that there was still something missing. And one of the wonders of becoming a Christian is instead of grasping onto control, what we have learned and continue to learn is to yield control to the Lord. And that happens in our lives over and over and over again in all kinds of different situations. We keep coming back to that same place of surrender. And when we do, we find that peace that passes all understanding, that helps to settle my heart and to be able to deal with difficult situations. That's the same thing parallel here that he describes with the boss. The same type of thing is going on. Verse 7, serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord and not men. Let's pray together. Well, the things we've talked about today are easy to do in some work situations and with some bosses, and in other situations, not so much. They can be quite difficult and challenging. And we battle with our hearts. We so want to be commended and to feel a sense of success and that we're doing something that somebody thinks we're doing well in. And there are just some work situations where that is just so rare. Lord, thank you that that's not the final answer, nor is it the highest thing of which we are to think. But that you are using our work situations, sometimes as difficult as they may seem to us, for very higher purposes. To shine the light of the gospel of who you are, of who Jesus is, and about the teaching that the Bible gives to us as Christians. And maybe for a boss who may not want to hear something about Christianity or something from the Bible, a different attitude coming from some of your people may be the strongest medicine for a boss who has cancer, heart cancer, to awaken him at a spiritual death and to bring him to spiritual life. Father, in our work, for those of us who still work, would you lift our eyes to these higher things that you've described here? Help us to see more than just the drudgery of work and the difficulties of a lame boss. Help us to see you at work, both in us and through us.